Thank you very much, and welcome everybody, and thanks for inviting me back. And thanks once more to our host, the Stratton Society, for inviting me to talk about Douglas Page M.C, Dr. Douglas Page. We heard in the first episode about Douglas Page's adventures and experiences on the Western Front, and how he, despite so many very near misses, he survived to tell us this fascinating tale. For rescuing men in open shell craters while under constant fire, he was awarded the Military Cross. Known to his family as Di, he was my wife Elizabeth's beloved grandfather, and we're also joined tonight by some of his grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren from this country and in Canada. So welcome to everyone. Please accept my apologies for the blurry nature of some of the photographs. These are originals taken on a cheap camera of the day, and I'm hoping to have them enhanced sometime in the future. We're still waiting for some results. Although we did receive one today, and we've added it to the talk for tonight. For more information on the more important stories in the diary, they're shown on the slide, so you can read more should you choose to do so. Presented here are just some snippets of the stories, and I urge you to read the whole episodes on the blog, which was a 4-year project. More information can be provided if you would like it at the end of the talk. So anyway, without further ado, after being gassed in April 1918 on the Western Front, Captain Douglas Page, now a seasoned 25-year-old war veteran, returned to England via a hospital ship and train. Landing at Southampton, from where he had embarked on his incredible journey in November 1915. He was taken to Somerville College, Oxford. The Women's College had been requisitioned for service as a hospital for officers during the Great War, and it was here that he began the slow process of recovery. After several weeks of care, he gradually recovered until he was well enough to help the medical staff attending to his fellow injured men. You can see here in the slide that the men in the slide are wearing uniforms which were royal blue with white collars. These were given to men that had been wounded so that they wouldn't be accosted in the street and accused of not doing their bit for the country when they'd already done it. He signed on to serve another term in November 1917, so in effect Douglas was still under contract when he received orders to return to duty. This time, however, despite the fact that, 440,000 men were sent to France from the start of the Kaiser's Spring Offensive, which lasted from March until August. It wasn't to be the Western Front. Possibly as a surprise twist to his army career, Douglas was to be sent to support the British participation of the not universally known about North Russian intervention. So Douglas left for Archangel from the Ellerman Line Quay in Newcastle upon Tyne around the 20th of August 1918 on the city of Cairo, and they arrived in Archangel on the 26th. Accompanying him on the journey of over 2,500 miles, and you can see the route in yellow as it goes all the way around Scandinavia, past Murmansk, which is in the Arctic Circle but doesn't freeze, down through the White Sea and down to Archangel just here into the mouth of the Dwina Bay, the mouth of the River Dwina. So accompanying him on the journey were members of the Royal Scots Regiment, the 2nd and 10th Battalion, a cycling battalion from Linlithgow made up of men deemed not physically capable of frontline duties. Short in stature with below par eyesight, they were normally deployed in office work as clerks and librarians, which was of course an essential part of the backroom that fighting forces need. 2 other people travelled with him that were to be a significant part of this story. Seemingly unknown to Douglas at the time, he met a 21-year-old man, Kenneth Kroll, on board. Kenneth was known to the Sturrock family of Leith that would eventually become Douglas's in-laws. Just a coincidence. Sadly, young Kenneth would never return. Also on board was a Russian woman named Maria Botchkareva, who had been in England trying to drum up support for her cause, along with a close entourage of supporters. She was traveling home to fight for the White Russians against the Bolsheviks. For her too, it would be her final sea voyage. For the ship, the city of Cairo, was a small part in an extraordinary existence. She survived into the Second World War, but was eventually torpedoed by U-boat number U-68 in 1942. That event led to an incredible story of daring and rescue worthy of a book on its own, and even more incredibly, lying in water 5,150 meters deep in the Atlantic, far deeper than Titanic, she was salvaged in 2016, giving up £34 million worth of silver coins. The spoils being split by the salvagers and the British Treasury. I shall in the near future hopefully be adding more of that story to the blog. Following the arrival in Archangel, Douglas set about finding his superior to find out where they were to be billeted. The Assistant Director of Medical Services, Colonel McDermott, had not prepared any billeting arrangements for the men and advised that they could stay aboard the ship until something could be found. McDermott asked Douglas if he'd brought any medical supplies with him, but Douglas had to inform them that no arrangements had been made. The Royal Scots fared no better as they had arrived with no rifles, theirs having been forgotten to be loaded. Eventually, they discovered a shipment that had been shipped for the Russian White Army, so they commandeered them for themselves. It was 2 days later that the billets were found for the men. Douglas was dispatched with orders almost straight away to gather up 7 days' ration from the quartermaster, Lieutenant Weary. Then he was told to report to Captain Scott on a barge on the river Dwina at Botchkareva. You can see in the slide, that's the key where the barge was dispatched from. The docks are opposite Archangel. There, a group of Royal Scots under the command of Captain Scott were preparing to embark on a mission up the river to a village called Siskia. The purpose of the mission was to go to the aid of Lieutenant Colonel Hazelden of B Force, who was hemmed in by the Reds between the villages of Oborskaya and Seletskia. And this map is a hand-drawn map drawn by Douglas in his diary. So you can see at the top is Archangel and Botchkareva, where they left from. The straight line down is the Vologda Railway, which was one of the fronts. So one force had been sent down to Oborskaya, which is here. And in modern day Russia, it's a junction on that very railway, but there was no junction at that stage. The river Dwina runs down here, that's known as the Northern Dwina, and the R.A.M.C river comes off down here and to Seletsko there. And the main part of this journey at the time was to Siskia, which is just there. So when he arrived on a decrepit old wooden barge, he found half of it was underwater and the men were taking refuge in the parts not yet submerged. Captain Frank Scott had under him 50 men of the 2nd and 10th Royal Scots. Along with them, there were 40 men of the Royal Marine Infantry under Captain Merchant. Merchant was an officer who Douglas Page got to know much better in time, but began to regard him as something of a shirker. Some of the officers involved out in Russia were war-weary, tired of such a long war. It was no wonder a few fell short of enthusiasm for this campaign. Douglas informs us. Lieutenant Colonel Sutherland of the 2nd and 10th Royal Scots, who was supervising the embarkation of the forward force, asked me if I had any medical supplies with me. I replied in the negative, as I'd not been ordered to bring any. On ascertaining that there were none on board, I immediately took steps to procure the same, and after some difficulty, managed to obtain a medical companion, a surgical haversack, 2 water bottles, and 2 stretchers from Lieutenant and Quartermaster Weary, R.A.M.C, 85th General Hospital. I had no R.A.M.C personnel attached to me, although I asked for 2 men. Moreover, there were no trained stretcher bearers in the party. But I taught 2 Royal Scots and 2 Marines a little first aid on the journey upriver. Moreover, there was no heating or cooking arrangements on board, although just before we started, we managed to acquire a stove of sorts from a neighbouring tug. The tug detailed to pull us upstream was a miserable little thing of about 12 horsepower and capable of doing about 2 miles an hour against the stream. We calculated that it would take us about 3 days to reach our destination, and this was supposed to be an urgent expedition. We eventually set off about 6:30 p.m. in a thick, damp mist and not in the best of spirits. About 10 p.m., having proceeded about 6 miles, we stopped and got some boiling water from the tug to make tea with. Then another tug came along, also proceeding upstream, but with nothing in tow. We hailed her, and after a lot of talking, luckily we had an interpreter with us, managed to persuade the new arrival to help us along. I slept that night amongst the men and was quite comfortable. All next day, which was dull and mild, we proceeded slowly on our way. The Royal Scots were given rifle and machine gun practice from the roof of the barge, as very few of them knew how to handle these war weapons. Most of them were undersized and maldeveloped, and many wore spectacles. Our food consisted of bully beef, biscuits, jam, and vile tea made from Dwina water from the boiler of one of the tugs. It's a wonder all of us hadn't diarrhea after drinking it. About 4 p.m. that day, a paddle steamer came rapidly downstream towards them and hailed us. She had a Russian Flying Corps lieutenant on board who had come from Seysk, our destination, in a great hurry to tell us that the Bolshevik forces, 300 strong, were marching on Seysk. And he also told us that a Slavo-British force of about 60 strong under Captain Shevtov, a colonel in the old Russian army, who was attempting to hold up the Bolshevik advance. After a hurried council of war, most of us, including Scott, Captain Merchant, Lieutenant Anderson, and myself, got onto the paddle steamer and steamed hell for leather to the relief of Seysk. A party of 12 men was left on the barge to guard our stores and baggage, and the small tug detailed to come along with it. The rest of the men were transferred to the second and larger tug, which followed us. Machine guns were mounted on the decks of our boat and rifles loaded. The excitement was intense. Captain Merchant lent me an ancient and cumbersome Spanish revolver captured from the Bolsheviks, and I prepared for the worst. In spite of all the excited Russian officer told us, none of us believed the situation to be so bad as he had painted it. There seemed to be no respite for Douglas now. Despite never having borne arms for the last 4 years of the war, he now finds himself brandishing a museum piece of a gun given to protect himself. What follows is an exciting episode in itself and an amazing departure from sick parades, blood-soaked hospitals and emergency surgeries. Douglas continued. Nothing further happened till about 10 p.m. when a sentry came down the stuffy little cabin which we occupied to tell us that there was some signalling with a lamp going on behind us. We all trooped up on deck, and there, sure enough, in the darkness, 100 yards or so behind us was a lamp signalling. As none of us knew the Morse code, we called up 2 Royal Scots signallers, and they interpreted the message as, "Stop!" So we stopped and wondered what was going to happen next. Was it a Bolshevik gunboat or what? Soon the boat came into view, and with a sigh of relief, we recognized it as a British motor launch. After some difficulty, she came alongside, and the commander, a young and cheery Lieutenant, Royal Navy, came aboard. He informed us that he had left Archangel at noon today with instructions to catch us up and tell us that the Bolsheviks were probably occupying Seysk, our landing place. He'd come up the Dwina at a rate of 22 knots an hour, some speed. He just caught us up in time, for we were then only a few miles from Seysk. We had yet another conference and eventually decided that the motor launch should go on ahead of us and find out if the coast was clear. So we crept along slowly with all lights out. It was a pitch black night, raw and cold. My Orlux lamp was useful in keeping us in touch with the motor launch. And you can see in the slide the very type of lamp. And if you want to buy one these days, you can get one for about 100 quid on eBay. And that looks just as it would have done then. That's a modern picture of the Northern Dwina. It's not changed in that time, I'm led to believe. Douglas continued. The adventurers returned about 3 a.m. and told us that the Bolsheviks were about 20 miles away and that Captain Shevtov and his Russians were in the village of Monastir about 5 miles off. So far, so good. We all went to sleep. It was a case of thinking on your feet for Douglas. No trained medical men to accompany him. He took some likely-looking men and quickly trained them in the rudiments of first aid. It was the experiences gained on the Western Front and other theatres of war at the time that saw the rapid development of first aid in the field. It highlighted the importance of getting fast treatment to injured men that would save not only their lives, but just as importantly for the army, greatly increased the chances of returning men to the front line. He continued, we were all up at daybreak on Sunday, September the 1st, and after a hurried breakfast of bully beef and biscuits, got men disembarked and then landed all our stores, ammunition and food, onto a dozen Russian carts, quaint Heath Robinson looking affairs drawn by sturdy little ponies and manned by all sorts of weird looking men. The main village of Seask lay about a mile from the river, and by the time we had arrived in the place, the whole population, male and female, had turned out to look at us. They were a funny looking crowd, and they swarmed around us when we halted in the middle of the village, asking for cigarettes and tobacco. And in one house, we found an ASC corporal in charge of Colonel Hazelden's base, and from him we drew a quantity of supplies. Here also we came across an American sailor, a tall, lanky fellow, had just arrived in Seask from Colonel Hazelden. He had come right through the Bolshevik lines and had ridden and walked several miles in the night. Meanwhile, Captain Scott had been indulging in a little recruiting through the interpreter and had got together a party of 35 Ruskies armed with rifles, who called themselves White Guards. Each had a dirty piece of white cloth tied round his left arm. They were a tough-looking crowd. We left Seask at about 9 o'clock en route for Monastir. And the slide shows that very march, the trek through the forest. The Royal Scots led the way, then came the Marines, next the White Guards, and the ragtime transport brought up the rear. The road, a sandy track, took us through some lovely country. There was a dense forest on our right all the way, and on our left, a swift-flowing river, and then a great lake with the forest behind. The autumn tints on the trees and bushes were very pretty, some of the trees being bright red and others a beautiful yellow. I noticed a lot of heather and blaeberries were plentiful. During a halt, one of the drosky drivers picked me a capful of these berries, which had a delightful flavour. His joy was wonderful to behold when I rewarded him with a cigarette. On reaching Monastir, we were met by Captain Shevdov and his 3 subalterns. They were obviously relieved to see us. Another conference ensued. We questioned one of the Captain Shevdov's men who had escaped from the Bolsheviks that morning. He had come about 10 miles barefooted and told us that the Bolsheviks were about 9 miles away, just beyond the village of Vumuga, and that they were in considerable force. The conference decided that Captain Shevdov's party should go forward in the afternoon and get in touch with the enemy, and that we would follow early tomorrow after a rest, which we all badly needed. After the usual army lunch, Lieutenant Anderson and I had a look around Monastir and district, and we found it to be a lovely spot. The village consisted of some heavy wooden houses situated on the edge of a beautiful lake. On the opposite side of the lake was a huge monastery, all white with green and blue and gold turrets and domes which glittered and glistened in the bright September sun. The clear reflection of this striking edifice in the smooth waters of the lake was wonderful. And that in the slide is that very Antonievo Siski monastery. And you can see the lake and the reflection in the water. This blurry picture of Lieutenant Anderson is the best one we can find at the moment, unfortunately, but it's better than nothing. So Anderson and I had a stroll round to the monastery after tea. An old priest, the usual type with long hair and beard and dirty, mouldy looking cassock, showed us around the place. It was a wonderful place inside. Huge glittering chandeliers hung from the domed roof. Beautiful paintings adorned the walls and crosses, etc., studded with precious stones were all over the place. It was a great sight. We saw the priest's vestments, which were made of gold cloth and decorated with jewels. Then the old priest showed us the small private chapel into which the Tsar, Tsarina, alas no more, and priests are allowed to enter. The kitchen of the monastery fairly took my breath away. I never saw such a huge place in all my life before. And the monk cooks in dirty white cassocks looked like goblins. In the extensive and well-kept gardens around the monastery, we noticed cabbages, potatoes, cucumbers, currants, etc. The priest made us a present of a loaf of black rye bread and some butter. The bread was very heavy and sour, and the butter, well, it was lard. Regular pilgrimages are made to this monastery at certain times of the year from all parts of Russia. There is accommodation for 300 pilgrims in the huge place. At night, we had patrols out all over the village. This is an American hand-drawn map of the area of the operation. You can see, again, Archangel at the top. This is a clearer map, gives you more idea of the perspective of where we're going. So he's now down at Sisk, just here, and they've marched down towards Seltsko, which is just here. Oborskaya is here on the Vologda Railway. The American army had arrived with it, and in September, at about September the 4th, they arrived and brought with them the Spanish flu, having lost men to it on the journey even across by sea. Things for the Allies were not going very smoothly. Heavily outnumbered in the field, they were thrust against an enemy that was difficult to see, with an ally that was often disinterested. Even the so-named White Army that they had come to support had many red sympathizers and infiltrators, and were an extremely unreliable ally. With winter rapidly approaching, things were not going to improve anytime soon. Entries in the diary had changed much in character from the days of the Western Front, which were often short and sometimes lacked a bit of detail. There were no French cafes and bars to retire to for a sing-song and merrymaking like in France and Belgium. Here it was bleak and unforgiving, with trees and mosquitoes as an unwelcome distraction from the enemy. Douglas writes, "The mosquitoes were very troublesome, and I was bitten all over the hands, face and neck. One or two of the Royal Scots had nasty swollen arms, and as a result of these pests, after dressing their arms with lint soaked in a solution of corrosive sublimate, I set them back to Vermuga to rest." So we see here corrosive sublimate. Not for the first time we hear of treatments that may have been effective over 100 years ago, but considered taboo these days. We've referred back to 1916 in the diary, when he was bathing men's feet in the Bassée Canal to relieve the terrible effects of trench foot, unaware of the dangers presented by Weil's disease present in canals. And then later in the same year, being instrumental in the research that actually discovered the presence of the disease in a rat that he actually caught on the Isa Canal. And this is the description of corrosive sublimate. Basically, it's made from mercury, and this is quite an important bit, very toxic to humans. At times, with a severe lack of medicines, any type to treat the many ailments that came his way, both with the military and in the civilian population, Captain Douglas Page would have to innovate, and often administered nothing more than army ration rum, the only thing available. He says, "About midnight, I was called out to a Russian soldier who had been sent down from the outposts. He was suffering from extreme exhaustion and was a very sorry sight. I gave him a good tot of rum and sent him to Vermuga. I wish my GP would follow his example." This is a number 2 field pannier showing its contents. Douglas asked for one to be sent up to him immediately, which would have arrived on the little hospital boat called Sanitary. And here is that boat. A small boat which took wounded and sick back and forwards to Archangel, bringing supplies up and down to the line up the Dwina River. Douglas Page introduced us to quite a few characters during the course of the diary. Some of these characters, however, have been enshrined into history themselves. One such was Madame Maria Botchkareva, who had travelled over on the same City of Cairo sailing as Douglas. Douglas again. Madame Botchkareva arrived in the forenoon and wanted to see Colonel Henderson, but he had the wind up and wouldn't grant her an interview. She wanted to get onto his staff. She was as fat, if not fatter than ever. A large load of rations arrived at night. In December 1918, the former Tsarist General Marashevsky, who was aged about 40, we don't have a pic, and not much over 5 foot tall, was in charge of the White Army in Archangel, and wrote, "Madame Botchkareva arrived from Shenkursk and reported to me on the 26th of December. She wore officer's uniform of a Caucasian pattern with epaulets. She was accompanied by Lieutenant Filipov, whom she described her as her adjutant. Madame Botchkareva offered me her services for work in the organization of the Russian forces. I do not undertake to estimate the merits of Madame Botchkareva's services in the Russian army. I consider that the shedding of her blood in the service of her country will be appreciated finally by the central government and Russian history. I only consider it my duty to declare that within the limits of the northern region, thank God, the time has already come for quiet creative work, and I consider that the summoning of women for military duties, which are not appropriate for their sex, would be a very heavy reproach and a distasteful stain on the whole population of the northern region. I order that Madame Botchkareva take off her uniform and that Lieutenant Filipov report immediately to the military command for registration, to be detailed for duties suitable to his rank and service. The carrying out of this order is placed under the supervision of the town commandant. So Douglas tells us more. I set off on Tuesday, the 22nd of October, on the second part of my Russian adventure. I crossed by boat at 1 o'clock to Botchkareva on the other side of the Dwina. So he's back in Archangel now, and proceeded to 82nd Casualty Clearance Station, where I put up for the night. All the next day I was busy buying stores, candles, soap, etc. from the canteen. I heard that Kenneth Kroll had been killed in the railway front. The news came as a great shock to me, and I was looking forward to seeing him again. The handwritten script on the slide says, Lieutenant Kroll, 2nd and 10th Royal Scots, was an Edinburgh boy who I got to know very well on the voyage out here from England. He'd only been up at the front for a day or two when an enemy shell landed in his dugout, killing him instantaneously. He was buried in a little military cemetery opposite the railway station at Oborskaya, in the depth of the Russian forest. The Royal Air Force officers were very kind and at my request made a cross out of an aeroplane propeller and erected it over Kenneth Kroll's grave. Kenneth Kroll is mentioned by General Ironside in his book Archangel 1918-19, and he now has a memorial in the Archangel Allied Cemetery in Archangel, North Russia. Although Douglas tells us that he met Lieutenant Kenneth Kroll on the city of Cairo, bringing them to Archangel, Kenneth was in fact well known to friends of the Page family, the Sturrocks of Leith. When I first read the mention of Lieutenant Kroll in General Ironside's Archangel book, I knew that it was a name familiar to me. Searching through family photographs, we came across the picture, this picture that you can see, that I knew that we had. Fortunately, a long gone relative had marked the backing paper of the picture, identifying those in the group. The group consisted of Kenneth Kroll, this is him here on the left, then aged about 18. Thomas Gordon Sturrock, who we described his unfortunate death on October the 16th, 1916, in the first episode of the diary, as he was shot down over Linsel on the on the French-Belgian border. Mrs. Annie Sturrock, Gordon and Douglas's mother, was later to become Douglas Page's mother-in-law, and Douglas Sturrock, just here, a lieutenant in the Royal Naval Voluntary Reserve, Gordon's older brother. Lieutenant Douglas Sturrock was attached to HMS Thaler, which was a shore-based posting based in Fife. He was involved in the development of the hydrophone, a predecessor of the sonar, important in the detection of submarines. The slide shows the converted drifter that they used for research on the Firth of Forth. This contemporary military map shows the position of Oborskaya again, so it doesn't differ much to the previous maps that we've seen. And Kenneth Kroll was buried in the small makeshift grave, which became lost in the forest eventually. After preparing the propeller and marking his grave, eventually the grave was lost, but Kenneth Kroll is remembered on this. You can see the back wall of this cemetery. This is the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery in Archangel. So the big cross there to the right of the cross on the wall is a list of men that have become lost, and Kenneth Kroll's name is preserved on there. Searching modern day maps, the name Seletskia, which is a village we'll hear a little bit more about, has disappeared, but the village would appear these days under the name Pogost. And although I can't confirm it, this is the nearest I can find to Seletskia church and a modern picture of what's left of the village, and there isn't a great deal. Looking around local houses, Douglas found that they all had the same basic layout. The inscription says, the interior of a Russian cottage, showing very clearly the famous Russian stove here, which is fired with wood marked A. So you can see the fire hole door there. And on the shelf at the top is used as a bunk in winter. So at the back here, it's just marked it on his picture. And here's his first hospital in Seletskia with his 3 excellent R.A.M.C. orderlies, as he says. The flag was made out of an old linen sheet that we found in the house. There it is there. And the cross was painted on with a concentrated solution of Condy's fluid, which is used for distilling, or not distilling, sanitizing water so that it could be safely drunk. Later on, one of the women in the village made me a beautiful Red Cross flag out of linen. And then that hospital proved to be too small, so they eventually found themselves a larger building to use. And this is it. You can see in this picture, Captain Page's shadow as he's taking the photograph. This happens in quite a lot of his pictures, actually. And the group of Royal Scots, we mentioned how they were men that were not fit for normal frontline duties against a normal R.A.M.C. orderly who towers above them. The Bolsheviks had their own air power, as seen here with this French aircraft. Douglas describes the men all staring at it as it flew over them and ignoring it, thinking it was one of their own, until it started dropping bombs on them. Only then did they begin to fire at it. Then there was this diary oddity, which is a picture I couldn't make out until he marked beside it. He said, this picture's been mounted upside down. And that's what it looks the right way up. A boat floating on the Dwina. We heard about Captain Scott, who set off on the barge with Captain Frank Scott. This is him here, and Lieutenant Jerome just behind him. And here in Seletskia, winter has just set in, and you can see the Russian orderly accompanying the British officer. So now, back in Archangel again, following his stint up the line in Seletskia, Douglas returned to Archangel and was based on the island of Solombola, which is at the top of the picture. Solombola was the place the British established their base hospital, the 85th General Hospital, which you can see at the top, directly opposite the main town of Archangel. It was connected by a bridge, which is just there, and we'll see a little bit more of that later. Botchkareva, where they set off on the journey up the river, down there. And another notable event that happened in December of 1918, mentioned by Douglas in his diary, was the battalion of Russian recruits pictured by, and trained and led by Sergeant Royce Dyer. Dyer was a Canadian recruited in 1914 as an infantryman. Like Douglas, Dyer was gassed in France but recovered. He was promoted to sergeant and again, like Douglas, eventually found himself in Archangel. He was given the task of training a force of Russians who had been given the grand title of the Slavo-British Allied Legion. Promoted to lieutenant and then captain for his efforts, he succumbed to pneumonia and died in December 1918. He was very well known and respected in Archangel, and such was the reverence that he was held in by the battalion. They carried his photograph wherever they went afterwards. They became known as Dyer's battalion. Dyer had been very careful to prevent any Bolshevik sympathizers from infiltrating the unit, but after his death, his British superiors weren't so meticulous. On the 7th of July 1919, they mutinied, killing all the British officers. This is the view of the hospital quarters taken by Douglas. So we have the original picture here This is the first of the pictures that we've had enhanced, and so far, really the only one, but we're hopeful to get it a bit more clear. And this is what it looks like with a bit of work on it. So the billets and messes for the 85th General Hospital. On the ground floor here is the canteen and the men's mess, and the centre floor is the NCO's mess, so the sergeants and NCOs. And the top floor was occupied by the officers who had their billets and the mess in this building. And looking out of the top floor from the officers' mess, Douglas has taken this picture of the hospital itself. This was the main hospital building, quickly converted from an incomplete wooden building that was half built when the British arrived. So in February 1919, with the onset of winter, the Allies found innovative ways of amusing themselves. With no shortage of wood, the Royal Engineers erected this enormous toboggan slide in Archangel. Douglas wrote, the toboggan ride near GHQ in Archangel afforded me much amusement when I saw it for the first time this week. It's a great affair. It starts from a height of about 100 feet from the roadway and slopes at first acutely and then gradually and then acutely again down onto the river. The whole run is about a half-mile long and is solid ice. Needless to say, a good toboggan at great speed is attained. The antics of several British sailors and their parishioners amuse me. Parishioners are young ladies. Huge crowds were watching the fun, and a long queue was waiting to climb up to the top of the chute. And adapting to conditions was an essential part of life for the forces in Russia. A two-horse sleigh made the most efficient ambulance. And when I first saw this picture, I thought it was the same picture as the previous one, but on closer inspection, the differences are clear. Captain Evans, closest to the sleigh, this man here, who was in charge of the sanitation unit, designed this one-horse version. So just to compare the two. And Captain Evans is pictured here outside his sanitary headquarters in Archangel. The large hospital ship Coggin is seen here passing Solombola Island, heading out of Archangel. She was a very familiar sight during the campaign, would eventually delay Douglas's arrival home. You can see the date on there if you want to see more on the Coggin and its history. So another thing that happened in December 1918, which was this mutiny that happened at the Constantine Barracks. It was taken, this picture was taken by an American forces photographer and shows the barracks on fire. It's difficult to see in this picture because of the snow. But Douglas wrote, on Wednesday, the 11th of December, some Russian troops billeted in Archangel refused to go up the line and barricaded themselves inside their barracks. They fired on anyone who came near them. American, French and British troops were rushed to the spot, surrounded the barracks and soon quelled the disturbance. An aeroplane dropped a bomb on the place and the Americans lobbed a few trench mortar bombs over the building. The ringleaders were arrested. They numbered 22 in all, and 11 of them were made to shoot the other 11 who had previously dug their own graves. This gruesome ceremony took place on the barrack square, which was surrounded on all sides by British soldiers with machine guns. Colonel Shevtov, who I met up at Seltska and who had commanded these rebels, afterwards committed suicide as he was so ashamed of his men. And you can see, look at the diary online at December 1918, you'll find the full story. There's a slightly closer picture there, which here, I don't know if you can see this very clearly, it's not very clear, but this is where the Constantine Barracks is, and it's actually on fire at the time. The story was told by Douglas, different somewhat to the account written by the man in charge, General Ironside, and required more investigation. The next slide shows the link to read the whole fascinating story. Well, it doesn't, but it gives you the time, which was December. Look on the diary for December. Douglas continued, on Monday the 16th of December, I was admitted to the 53rd Stationary Hospital suffering from influenza and a severe pain in the left hip, which was diagnosed diagnosed as gluteal neuritis, but which eventually turned out to be rheumatoid arthritis. This had eventually been brought on, no doubt, firstly from being struck on the hip by a large piece of shell at Langmark, Belgium, and secondly from exposure in the swamps up the line. For a while, the occupant of one of the other beds in my ward was Lieutenant Commander Richardson, DSO, DSC, Albert Medal, etc. Before the war, he was a chief mate on the cargo boat plying between Hull and the continent. During the war, he'd spent most of his time in Russian waters on various boats, most of which had been sunk under him. He'd been torpedoed 3 times in the Black Sea and had many thrilling tales to tell. He talked Russian fluently and was a tough customer. Again, looking the diary for December. The slide shows Richardson's medal roll. He was an enigmatic figure, thrilling Douglas with stories of his daring do during the war, but these were not just stories. Richard had no time or second thoughts when it came to the crunch. He was awarded the DSC and the Albert Medal for his bravery and saving lives. In May 1919, Richardson took command of the paddle steamer London Belle, which we'll see more of later, and worked when she was of most use ferrying men and supplies in the shallow waters of the Dwina. Another document confirming his commission and his orders. Following his stint up the line as senior medical officer in Selotska, Douglas had returned to Archangel and is seen here standing on the frozen river during the winter. This is the entrance to the 53rd General Hospital based in Archangel, where Douglas was admitted with flu. So this was the American base hospital. Another of the characters that Douglas talks about is Captain Count Campello, an Italian. But alas, despite some decent photos of him, information has been hard to come by. And here we have snow clearing bolos. Bolo was a common slang term for Bolsheviks, a common sight in winter in the streets of Archangel where parties of prisoner of wars used to clear snow from the streets. During the Soviet period, this was a job largely done by women who would shovel it into tipper trucks for dumping. Lieutenant Anderson and Douglas Page took themselves off to a photographic studio to have photos taken. He tells us that the photographer tried to charge them 75 rubles, but eventually settled for something like 3 rubles each. The colouring was done by me on a phone app, so it's not brilliant, but it brings a little bit of life to it, I think. St. Patrick's Day, March 1919, was a sunny day in Solombola, and Douglas poses outside with nurses outside his hospital. And these 3 boats here are monitors, simply known as M25, M27 and M33. They carried a powerful artillery gun and were a serious threat to the enemy along the northern Dwina. M25 and M27 were scuttled during the evacuation of Archangel after becoming grounded, as the river water level drops drastically in summer. M33 made it home, however, and is preserved in the Royal Historic Dockyard in Portsmouth, where you can see where she was hit by a Bolshevik shell that pierced the starboard hull and ricocheted off the bulkheads in the stern without exploding or hurting anybody. It was probably ammunition stolen from Archangel, therefore a British shell that didn't go off, quite a common occurrence at the time. One day, Douglas looked out of his window to find a house next door on fire. Another common occurrence in the wooden houses. British forces extinguished the fire and rescued an old Russian woman from the burning building. And you can see the aftermath of the fire. So this is the transport ship Stephen, of 4,435 gross tons, built in 1910, probably the busiest of all the ships bringing supplies into Archangel, constantly mentioned by most that wrote accounts of the expedition to Archangel. On the left, passing Solombola, and on the right, arriving with the relief forces on May the 27th. Despite being hopeful of getting home on a return journey, Douglas missed out. In May, the relief was finally sent to Archangel for the men that had endured the tough winter and allowed many to return home, their war finally over. The relief was mainly provided by the Royal Hampshire Regiment and were warmly welcomed by the authorities in Archangel, who erected a large wooden triumphal arch in the town. Douglas described it. The newly arrived British troops had a triumphal march through the streets of Archangel on the 27th of May and were very enthusiastically received by the Russian population. Flags were flying and great crowds lined the streets. Banners were displayed bearing the words, "Welcome to the British, a friend in need is a friend indeed," etc. It seemed that no American flags were in evidence and that the Yanks out here were very annoyed at this. Throughout his army career, Douglas Page took a leading role in organising concert parties for the men. He co-wrote and appeared in sketches, often played the piano, and here performed with his Archangel troupe of Pierrot clowns. The picture on the left depicts members of the troupe watching the arrival of the relief force. He wrote, "That night the Pierrot troupe, which Quartermaster Freeman and I have been training for the last fortnight, gave its first performance in the YMCA hut at Sonambola. The place was packed and there were many officers present from Archangel. The show went off very well and we had a tremendous reception. We didn't finish until 10:30 p.m. owing to having so many encores, a 3-hour show." So General Ironside, the chief commanding officer, takes a salute from the real relief force. This time, unlike the Royal Scots, here you can see the Hampshires remembered to bring their rifles. And Russian crowds, many which turned out to welcome the relief force as they marched through the town. Much of the summer of 1919 was spent entertaining themselves by swimming and boating on the Dwina. They would often take out a boat and then take themselves off to one of the neighbouring islands. These pictures show the bridge that we spoke about before, connecting Archangel to Botchkareva across the Dwina. On the left, you can see the large wooden structure, just here, which was to protect the bridge from the crushing effect of ice in the winter. Of course, in the winter, they didn't need the bridge. During the summer of 1919, Douglas and his pals, with much lightened workload due to repatriation of many of the troops, amused themselves on the river Dwina. Douglas mentions Nurse Valentine and remarked that she spoke Russian like a native. This may not have been a surprise to Douglas, as he had realised that she was born in Russia. The story of Selma Valentine is one of an incredible woman who's little known about these days, but is worthy of more study. She spoke Russian, English, German, and French. During her lifetime, she would live in London, Paris, and Johannesburg, and met many people of note, including Queen Alexandra and her son, King George V, Hitler, Mussolini, and many others. Suspected of being a Bolshevist, she was arrested by the British in Shenkursk, where she was looking after her parents who had lost everything to the Reds. Then she joined the Royal Navy as a Wren. She was also a VAD nurse, returning to teach in Shenkursk. She would leave Russia when the British evacuated later in 1919, and she was active in India and South Africa, where she died on the 6th of November 1968. And again, more on her in June 1919, referred to the diary. Throughout the whole campaign, there were many instances of unrest in all the forces involved, not least the British, who, many of which mutinied, but mainly with the newly recruited Russians. July 23rd brought a report of yet another on the Onega, not the one at Dyer's battalion, but yet another one to the west of the Archangel district. And this was a report on it. You can't read it all, obviously, but again, you can if you look on the diary. So most of you will recognise this scene, and passing under Tower Bridge is the paddle steamer London Belle. In more familiar territory, She plied her trade between the Pool of London, Woolwich, and the newly established resorts of East Anglia, like Walton, Clacton, Lowestoft, and Great Yarmouth. That trade came to a halt with the outbreak of war in 1914. Two of the little steamers, the Walton Belle and her larger sister, London Belle, were requisitioned by the Navy. Their small draft and side panels made them well suited for the shallow waters of the River Dwina, and they made the long, slow journey to Archangel. Normally, they would only carry enough fuel to make London and Yarmouth and back with a bit to spare. They had no overnight accommodation with only passenger saloons and a bar, restaurant, etc. They were used to ferry the sick and wounded from the front to Archangel, where they were ideally suited to the shallow waters of the northern Dwina. During May 1919, command of the London Belle was given to Lieutenant Richardson until he returned home. London Belle remained on duty on the Dwina until the 15th of August, when she sailed for home, taking only her crew, 3 officers and 1 other. Here's another order confirming Edward Richardson's command of the London Belle. To read more about Richardson, refer to the diary. One of the most senior generals of the campaign in France was General Rawlinson, known as Rawley by General Haig. He was sent out to Archangel to oversee the orderly withdrawal of troops and given a deadline to remove as much of Britain's assets as possible. Gradually, the 85th General Hospital began to reduce its operations as staff were repatriated. In the end, only a handful of officers and sergeants remained who were tasked with having to look after themselves and do their own washing and cooking, etc. Unthinkable. Kildonan Castle was one of the largest ships to regularly ply between Archangel and the UK, and once more left with a large complement of men and refugees. Douglas was sure there must be space had he been forgotten. One day he met with General Rawlinson and told him that he'd been out there almost a year. Rawlinson seemed surprised, but still Douglas had to hang on until the day finally came. Captain Page and his remaining comrades, along with 87 other ranks and a large complement of Russians, 40 officers and 406 men, as well as a number of civilian refugees. These included some of the nurses from the 85th General Hospital. Also on board were 4 French, 82 Lithuanians, 58 Chinese, and 30 Koreans, which gives you an idea of the diversity of the people that were there. Cap Verde was a German passenger liner. During the course of the war, she had remained safe in the port of Hamburg from 1914 till the end of the war. Following the war's end, she was given to Britain as part of the war reparations. And here's the promenade deck of the liner on the way back, and you can see the crowds of his friends at the far end of the promenade deck. And one of his theatre sisters, who also escaped the clutches of the Bolsheviks, heading for the safer climes of the UK. And a picture as they're 2 days out from Archangel, heading no doubt up into the Arctic Ocean. And officers with an unnamed Russian ward sister. For a day, they cruised along the coast of Scotland, and they could pick out all the familiar villages along the coast. And on the left, you can see the Bell Rock Light as they came down the east coast of Scotland. And Douglas spied the Ely Light and the village of Ely, which he's become very familiar with later in life. And so now they're approaching Edinburgh and home. At long last, after cruising alongside the coast of Scotland, where they could pick out all those villages and lights along the shores, they approached the Firth of Forth. And just north of the island of Inchkeith, the Cap Verde came to a stop and dropped anchor. In a final twist of the long tail, Scotland was too busy to accept them home. Here they would have to wait for the busy docks in Leith until they were able to offer them a berth. Douglas, though, was used to this. In 1915, on his very first voyage, he had to wait aboard for a day for the weather to settle before they could leave for France. And when they arrived, they had to wait many, many hours before the port could handle them. Anchored just north of Inchkeith with its lighthouse and unable to access a berth, they had to wait until 3 p.m. the following day for the Kalyan, the hospital ship that we saw earlier, and the Tsaritsa, another one of the regular former Cunard ships that made the journey backwards and forwards with troops, to leave their berths to return to Archangel before they could finally head into the docks. Inchkeith had a mention earlier in the diary when attending the 1915 Christmas Day Mass in France, where he says, "There was a great jingling of little bells and loud moans from an ancient precentor who had a voice like the Inchkeith foghorn on a particularly foggy night." So, the girl on the bicycle in this wonderful picture is Elizabeth Mary Sturrock, known to her family as Elma. While home on leave in Edinburgh during the 1916, Douglas mentioned going for a day out in the country with Mrs. Sturrock and company in their motor car. She was accompanied by her daughter at the time, just sweet 16. No mention of her is made in his diaries after that. But after arriving back at Leith on Friday, September the 12th, 1919, just 50 days later, Captain Douglas Charles Mary Page M.C. and Elizabeth Mary Sturrock were married at St Cuthbert's Church in Edinburgh. And this is a photo of the order of service that we still have. Not the oldest picture of him, but a fine one nevertheless, age 9. And after working as a GP in Stowe in the Scottish borders, he eventually set up as a GP in Pittenweem, Fife, where he remained in practice until his retirement in 1957. He's seen here receiving his retirement clock from Lord Crawford, one of his patients. He retired to Banchory on Royal Deeside, then bought a bungalow in Torfins where he resided with Elma until his death. In the garden, home in Aberdeenshire, he died of a heart attack in 1965, aged 71, and was buried at Torfins. Elma lived on until 1974 when she too died and was buried alongside him. Douglas Charles Mary Page had a long war. He signed up in 1914 but returned to his medical studies in November 1915 when he was sent to the Western Front as a fledgling doctor. Having served his king and country very well, surviving many close calls, and when most of the country was celebrating the end of that terrible conflict, the now Captain Page M.C. was sent to the wilds of North Russia, not to return home until almost 11 months after the end of World War I. What did that little spoken about conflict achieve? Well, the Smithsonian Institute sums it up pretty well on their website. Referring to American President Woodrow Wilson's decision to support the campaign, which can equally apply to the British, they say, historians tend to see Wilson's decision to send troops to Russia as one of his worst wartime decisions and a foreshadowing of other poorly planned American interventions in foreign countries in the century since. It didn't really achieve anything. It was ill-conceived, says Nelson of the Polar Bear expedition. Polar Bear was the nickname given to the American forces out there. The lessons were there that could have been equally applied in Vietnam and could have been applied in Iraq. The director of archives at the World War I Museum in America said, "We didn't have clear goals in mind politically or military," he says, "but we have an interest to protect, but it's not really our interest to protect, or at least to make a huge effort at it. Maybe there are lessons we should have learned." And here's the website where you can see everything on. It was published as a blog celebrating the centenary of each event. Please choose a month in the archives, which you can see listed down there. They're all 100 years after the event. So if it says August 2019, that's when we published it, but it refers to August 1919, etc. And at the top, there is a search box where you can enter a search term, and it's quite good at picking out where any information that you'd like to try and find. Look out for a coming ebook. Please submit your email addresses to us to be notified, or subscribe to the website, which you would receive any emails and updates automatically. So, spasibo и до свидания. Thank you and goodbye.